Good morning. This is going to be part one of a three-part series I want to do on the astrology of the 2020s for America and the world. And I think this is really important. I think it's very important to understand from an astrological perspective where we've been, why certain things have been happening, where we're likely to be headed next, and what's going to happen for the rest of the decade. So let's see if I can share my screen here, get things going. Hold on just one more second. Okay, so we'll talk about the astrology of the 2020s for America and the world. And let's see. There we go. First, let me acknowledge that some who watch this video may not believe in astrology. I can completely understand their reticence. It's often referred to as a pseudoscience, and many physicists regularly scoff at its claims. This problem is exacerbated these days by both a paucity of astrologers trained in the methods of statistics and data analysis, and by critics in the world of science who likewise have little understanding of astrological theory. In my opinion, however, the validation of astrology rests upon three pillars. The first one I call the astrological hypothesis assumption, or AHA. And I define this as the premise that there do indeed exist linkages between at least some celestial and terrestrial events. At this point in time, I would claim that the evidence for AHA is overwhelming, and much of it comes from established fields of science with names like chronobiology and heliobiology, as well as credible statistical studies by both astrologers and non-astrologers, and by some studies in astrophysics on the sun's impact upon terrestrial events. And I've already outlined some of this evidence in previous videos I've made on scientific evidence that supports astrology. Now, the second pillar for the validation of astrology comes from those scientific studies that help verify what I call standard astrological theory, or SAT for short. Much of the work in establishing the second pillar has been either statistical in nature or through studies that involve extreme case sampling. And several of these studies have confirmed many basic beliefs that lie at the core of what most astrologers believe, while also suggesting that some things may work a little differently than we think. And then the last pillar that must be present to validate astrology is personal experience. I grant you that many people can be very gullible, but nonetheless, if there is validity to at least some of astrology, then it must be something that we can see working daily with our very eyes. These days, my focus is mostly on mundane astrology, the study of how celestial cycles relate to terrestrial events. And as my understanding of this field has deepened, I've been amazed at how well astrology illuminates both current and past events. Thus, for me, there's no question that astrology works. However, that doesn't mean that I believe in every single rule that some astrologer has at some time put forth. Some theories may indeed be false, but the reality is that astrology is vast enough that not all of us can fully vet every single idea, and some things may work while others may not. Okay, nonetheless, the core theories and beliefs that most astrologers learn, what I call SAT, do indeed seem to work quite well. And if the three pillars I've described don't validate astrology, I'm not sure that we can have faith in any body of knowledge because, in my opinion, the evidence for SAT is now that strong. And this brings me to what I want to talk about today, the grand cycles that we currently find ourselves in the midst of, and how they will likely affect America and the rest of the world for this decade. I feel that it's very important for people to understand these cycles and how they have driven some of the events that we have seen in recent years, and how we might best prepare for what lies ahead. There are some definite challenges ahead, but the good news is that, according to astrology, we've probably been through the worst of it. I'll start with the year 2020, and I'll begin with a discussion of the Barbeau Planetary Cycle Index that was used by the late great mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau, along with other indicators to predict the likelihood of a pandemic at least 11 years before the beginning of 2020. All right, so I'll start with 2020, and part one, I'm going to go through 2022. Now, the Barbo planetary cycle, I have a graph of it here for the century. It was at its low for the century from the beginning of 2020 until late March 2022. And this index is a cumulative sum of the distances between the outer planets from Jupiter through Pluto. And when the index is low, that means that the outer planets are bunched close together, resulting in an imbalance. Thus, if you feel like you've been through the ringer for the past 3 years, from 2020 through 2022, you have. Also, let me mention that for America, I used both a July 2nd, 1776 chart for the passage of the resolution for independence and a July 4th, 1776 chart for when George Washington was informed of this decision. In each chart, Neptune is in Virgo square Mars and Gemini, and the slow-moving planets transits through Pisces can inflame passions, disinformation, and violence in America. Additionally, I often display mundane charts with a 0 degrees Aries rising if I'm not completely convinced of the birth time. But above, I show the July 2nd chart with Libra as the rising sign, and on the right is the July 4th Sibley chart with Sagittarius rising. And I'll use both these charts in my analysis. Also, much of what is going on now is a continuation of the 2020 conjunctions of Saturn with Pluto and Saturn with Jupiter. We had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction near the start of 2020 and the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction near the end of 2020. So, on January 12th, 2020, Pluto, death, conjunct Saturn, destruction, in Capricorn began a cycle of transformation of structures that will last until 2053. This was essentially the start of the pandemic and other major changes, and is also the date on which I got COVID for the very first time. Furthermore, since this conjunction occurred in the 22nd degree of Capricorn, this may add extra tension to the situation. And this is because 22.5 degrees is 3/4 of the way through a 30-degree cycle, just as 270 degrees is 3/4 of the way through a 360-degree cycle. Hence, this degree position in any sign may be like a waning square. Additionally, Andre Barbeau observed that pandemics and conflicts are often triggered by hard aspects between Saturn and Pluto, particularly when they're magnified either by Jupiter, an eclipse, or other adverse conditions. And the January 10th eclipse set the stage for what followed. And on this eclipse, 2 days before the exact conjunction of Saturn with Pluto, all of these conditions were present. It was a lunar eclipse. Jupiter at 8 degrees Capricorn was conjunct the south lunar node at 8+ degrees Capricorn. Saturn and Pluto were within minutes of being conjunct one another. And Chiron was making a bit of a square to both of the nodes in this lunar nodal axis. Okay. Furthermore, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on January 12th, 2020 was conjunct China's natal Jupiter at 22+ degrees Capricorn, which you can see right here. And Jupiter is also the ruler of China's rising sign of Sagittarius over here. Hence, it's no wonder, at least from an astrological perspective, that the pandemic began in China. Now, on March 20th, 2020, Jupiter and Mars were conjunct in Capricorn at the same degree as the recent Pluto-Saturn conjunction, and this energized and expanded the original Pluto-Saturn impulse and the COVID pandemic. Then on November 12th, 2020, Jupiter and Pluto were conjunct at 22+ degrees Capricorn right over here, and this brought the pandemic back to the forefront. However, while Saturn contracts, Jupiter expands, And we saw not only a surge in COVID cases, but also the development of effective vaccines. Uh, that month, we got news of successful trials for these vaccines that we were all going to be encouraged to take. And now for America. In the July 2nd, 1776 chart for America, if the time is correct, transiting Chiron was in opposition to the ascendant and square the midheaven. This was an aspect that could result in wounding for both the country and its president, just as was the case with COVID. And you can see I've got in sort of a green rectangle here when that opposition square by Chiron was in effect through a lot of the year. At the same time, transiting Pluto was conjunct the natal moon and opposite natal Mercury. Hence, the people of America experienced higher infection and death rates from COVID than most other countries, and commerce and supply chains were deeply affected by the pandemic. Uh, the impact of Pluto on the moon in this July 2nd, 1776 chart and its opposition to Mercury in that chart, that was pretty much active throughout the majority of the year. Okay, additionally, transiting Neptune in Pisces activated the natal Neptune-Mars square in the July 1776 charts, and disinformation, conspiracy theories, and violence and threats of violence began to increase. That's represented by what's in this dark blue rectangle right here. And then, just to make matters worse, transiting Saturn spent much of the year either conjunct natal Moon or in opposition to natal Mercury or in conjunction with natal Pluto, shown here in this red rectangle. And restriction and rebellion were on the increase, and the deaths of Black citizens at the hands of the police energized the Black Lives Matter movement. However, there were also some good aspects for America in 2020 involving Chiron, Uranus, Jupiter, Pluto, and Neptune. I have that all in rectangles up here, the good stuff that made an impact. So, COVID vaccines were quickly developed as progressive politics experienced a surge in the polls. Additionally, a brief retrograde of Jupiter from Aries back into Pisces during the 2020 presidential election likely influenced voters to elect the more progressive candidate. But also influencing the voters might have been the impending Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that happened and became exact at the end of December. So, on December 21st, 2020, Jupiter and Saturn were conjunct at 0+ degrees Aquarius. This conjunction happens every 20 years, but this one was a mutation conjunction, since it signaled a shift to air signs after spending about 200 years in Earth signs. With both Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto shifting from Earth into air, we are moving away from materialism into an age of ideas, invention, collaboration, and relationships. Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions always try to restore balance between growth and restriction, freedom and regulation. However, they also have a history of shaking things up in Europe. For the past several hundred years, these conjunctions have had a particular impact on European affairs, and this is just one of the astrological reasons behind the war in Ukraine right now. Okay, on March 31st, 2020, prior to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the malefic planets Mars and Saturn were conjunct at 0+ degrees Aquarius, and the COVID pandemic was raging. This conjunction added a touch of aggression restriction to this position, while also representing the global collaboration and aggressive science that occurred to combat the pandemic. And now let's get into the year 2021. The major aspect of 2021 was a repeating square between Saturn and Aquarius and transiting Uranus and Taurus. This represented a likely clash between governing bodies or groups that regulate things and people's individual desires for freedom and independence. In particular, this aspect could be seen manifesting all around the world in terms of opposition to face masks, vaccines, and other measures deemed necessary to control the pandemic. In America, the clash between those in control and those who wanted to do whatever they desired was seen very dramatically during the insurrection on January 6th. However, at the same time, we had three sextiles between Saturn and Chiron, and this suggests that there were also those who responded to the pandemic by rising to the occasion and being their best selves. Hence, particularly in America, we saw both the best and the worst that lies within people. Okay, for America, the year began with a lot of hard astrological aspects. In January, Chiron was square Jupiter, and Pluto was conjunct the moon and opposite Mercury. And Neptune was getting closer to its exact square with Mars that took place in February. Deaths from COVID were surging at this time, as you can see in this graph right here. And of course, the major story of the year, as I've said, was the January 6th insurrection. Okay, here we look at the impact of the transits of January 6th on the January 2nd, 1776 chart for America. And there were several transits creating tension in this chart on January 6, 2021. Transiting Pluto, destruction was closely conjunct the moon, the people, and opposite Mercury, the people's voice. Transiting Uranus, revolution was square the natal lunar nodes, which intensifies everything. You can see that square right here. It's very strong, very exact. And transiting Neptune was opposite natal Neptune, creating delusion, and transiting North Node intensity was conjunct natal Mars, aggression. So everything here was very exact. The North Node at 19 plus degrees Gemini, conjunct natal Mars, 19 plus degrees Gemini. Transiting Neptune at 18 plus degrees Neptune, opposite natal Neptune at 22 plus degrees, not exact, but with an orb. And let's see, we also had Pluto at 24 plus degrees Capricorn, strongly conjunct natal moon at 25 plus degrees Capricorn, opposite natal Mercury at 25 plus degrees Cancer. Okay. Finally, later in 2021, in August and December, transiting Pluto was once again in conjunction with natal moon here and here, and opposite natal Mercury in the July 2nd, 1776 chart for America. And once again, the number of deaths from COVID in America began to rise as we continued to grapple with all sorts of disruptions in our supply chains. And here you can see the rise in cases of COVID under this transit. And now let's move on into review of the events of 2022. At first glance, 2022 didn't look so bad from an astrological perspective. Outer planet aspects in February looked great, and there was a long anticipated conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces that many were optimistic about. So here is what was going on in February. Doesn't look bad. This is just transit to transit stuff. And here is the conjunction of Jupiter with Neptune on March 11th. Okay, however, the reality was that that conjunction, this one right here, also led to global inflation. And the year actually began with a literal bang, the war in Ukraine. Additionally, there was a conjunction in July of Uranus and the North Node in Taurus, right over here, that we'll talk about later. So, astrologically speaking, why did Russia invade Ukraine on February 24th? Well, remember that the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index hit its absolute low for the century in March 2022. Furthermore, from January through April of 2022, the non-lunar planets were hemmed in on one side by the lunar nodes, a condition known as Kalasarpa Yoga that inhibits the flow of energy. Thus, the first 3 months of 2022 were probably the worst time of the last 3 years. And the origins of this invasion can be traced back to the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto at the start of 2020. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Vladimir Putin's chart. I should point out there is some disagreement about his birth time and birthday. That's probably because he initially lied about his age to get into the army or the KGB. But the chart I'm using here is what most astrologers use, and I've seen it work very well. It's has a birth date of October 7th, 1952. Okay, and on January 12th, 2020, the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction made a strong quincunx to Putin's natal Pluto at 22 plus degrees Leo. That's conjunct his lunar nodal axis. You can see that right here, transiting Saturn, Pluto, down here, 22 plus degrees Capricorn, Putin's natal Pluto at 22 plus degrees Leo, pretty close to his the south lunar node in his chart. All right, and this also squared his 12th house Mercury-Neptune conjunction. 12th house, the house of self-undoing, among other things. And this was a very strong square. And this sort of increased, intensified his delusions and his self-undoing. And the quincunx probably stimulated his uncontrollable desires for power and conquest. Thus, Saturn-Pluto likely fueled his desire to possess Ukraine. Okay, on February 24th, 2022, Mars and Venus were both at 22 plus degrees Capricorn. Remember, that is where the initial Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurred. And this is when Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, while the pandemic was being brought under control, the impact on Putin of the 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction was just beginning to unleash its most destructive power. Also on February 24th, 2022, Saturn was making a strong square to natal Pluto in Ukraine's chart, and this created a resonance with the 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction. You can see here we have Saturn at 18 degrees Aquarius, square natal Pluto at 17 plus degrees Scorpio in this chart for Ukraine. And Saturn was also conjunct Ukraine's moon at 22 plus degrees Aquarius. So this square, it created a resonance with the 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Additionally, Chiron, which often causes wounding, was square natal Uranus, and the lunar nodes were squaring natal Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter. So this is all pretty exact. Transiting Chiron at 10 plus degrees Aries, squaring natal Uranus at 10 plus degrees Capricorn. And let's see, the lunar nodes at 26 plus degrees, both of them making us strong squares to Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus here in Ukraine's 8th house of death. Things look bad. Meanwhile, in America, we experienced 3 Pluto returns in 2022, with the first one happening 2 days before the invasion of Ukraine. Also, squares in opposition from Chiron to America's natal sun and Saturn resulted in much wounding through extreme weather, mass shootings, and the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. Okay, additionally, the good aspects of transiting Neptune to Moon and Mercury in the July 2nd, 1776 chart for America appear to have resulted in a consumer optimism that only fueled severe inflation in America. And as is often the case in astrology, cycles in history repeat themselves. Up here from 1972 to 1975, transiting Chiron made a series of oppositions to natal Saturn and a series of conjunctions to natal Chiron in July 1776 charts for America. These aspects can trigger either wounding, healing, or transcendence. Now, Chiron really nudges us to transcend ourselves and our situations. But to do that, it often has to first crack this hard shell that Saturn has erected. That leads to wounding that then needs to be followed by healing. And in 1972, the major story during this period was Watergate, the Watergate scandal. That was the wounding for America, and the Senate Select Committee to investigate the scandal. That is the transcendence we saw. We saw one of Congress's final moments as that Watergate committee came together and did some of its finest work. And also during this time, Roe v. Wade. 1972 was when the Supreme Court legalized the right for women to have control over their own bodies. And we're now experiencing something similar to what we saw in the 70s over the years from 2022 through 2025, with a very near miss of Chiron conjunct natal Chiron lasting from June through September of our current year, 2023. So in the July 1776 charts for America, this is what's going on. And so far during this period, we've seen the January 6th committee, transcendence again, one of Congress's finer moments. And we've seen the ongoing investigation of the January 6th insurrection of 2021, which was a major wounding to our country. Also, Roe v. Wade, back in the news again, as in 2022, the right that the Supreme Court gave to women in 1972 to have control over their own bodies. They took that right away in 2022. And that's causing a lot of wounding for America. And there's more wounding ahead, all the way up to early 2025. So, all in all, 22 was a horrible year for the world, with the first 3 months being particularly brutal due to the war in Ukraine that coincided with the low of the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index and Kalasarpa Yoga. And in the fall of 2022, an almost exact square of Saturn and Aquarius to Uranus and Taurus manifested as more tension between individuals and regulatory bodies. Meanwhile, in America, the three Pluto returns signaled a crisis in our democracy and conflict with Russia, while oppositions to Saturn, natal Saturn by Chiron, coincided with mass shootings at Top Supermarket and in Uvalde, massive hurricane damage in Florida, and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And that's going to end our review of the first 3 years of the 2020s. And that's part one. And so we're going to continue next with part two, which will be the years 2023 through February 2026. So let me stop my screen sharing, and I'm back. And so I'm going to stop recording now, and the next the next part in this series will cover the years 2023 through 2026 for America and the world. And now let me stop recording. So long for now. I hope to see you again soon.